The world in our quiet Cambridge study was flat, known, and beautifully rendered in ink. My husband Alistair was a cartographer for the Royal Geographical Society, a man whose life was dedicated to the eradication of blank spaces. His maps were things of austere beauty, where every mountain range stood in precise hachures, every river flowed with calibrated grace, and every coastline was a definitive statement against the chaos of the sea. Our love was his most cherished map, a territory explored, documented, and settled. We lived in a Georgian townhouse that was a temple to order, books arranged by height and century, Persian rugs aligned with mathematical certainty, a grand walnut partner's desk where we worked opposite each other in respectful silence. I was Clara, the cartographer's wife, a former research archivist whose own world had gently contracted to the borders of his. Our life was a masterpiece of quiet predictability. I mistook the profound absence of error for the presence of passion. My rebellion began not with a shout, but with a whisper of phantom geography. I had taken a part-time position at the university library, organizing a bequest of travel journals from a forgotten Victorian explorer. The work was meant to be a gentle diversion, a way to keep my mind engaged, as Alistair kindly put it. The journals were a riot of subjective experience, full of smudges, emotional outbursts, and sketches of beasts that couldn't possibly exist. They were the antithesis of Alistair's work, and I found myself drawn to their glorious inaccuracy. It was in the library's cavernous, dusty-smelling annex that I first heard his voice. He was arguing with the head librarian about access to the restricted folklore collection. "But don't you see," he was saying, his voice a warm, resonant baritone that seemed to push against the stifling quiet. "The map is not the territory. Your charts tell me where a mountain is. The stories tell me why it matters, why it's haunted, why people avoid its shadow at dusk. That's the real topography." I peered around a stack of ledgers. He was tall, with a mane of unruly dark hair, silvering at the temples, and wore a leather jacket over a corduroy shirt and a front to the tweed and flannel uniform of the academy. He gestured with hands that looked more accustomed to holding a climbing rope or a pint glass than a pen. His name, I learned from the heated discussion, was Rhys Morgan. He was an anthropologist, a folklorist, a collector of narratives, currently on sabbatical to write a book on cartographic myths. He lost the argument but won my attention. Later, as I sorted through journals describing mermaids off the coast of Skye, he appeared at my carrel. "I hear you're the keeper of the mad Captain Forsyth's dreams," he said, grinning. He had a smile that carved deep lines around his eyes, lines of laughter and weather. "Any good sea serpents?" "Several," I said, surprising myself with my own smile. "And a very passionate account of a talking walrus he was convinced was a Russian spy." He laughed, a rich, unguarded sound that echoed in the silent hall. "Now that's primary source material. The truth is always stranger than the contour line." He introduced himself properly. When I gave my name, he tilted his head. "Clara Finch, you're Alistair Finch's wife." It wasn't a question. Everyone in certain circles knew Alistair. His work is impeccable, a surveyor's soul. I heard the unspoken comparison. My soul, by implication, was something else. Something perhaps less impeccable, more amenable to talking walruses. It was the first crack in my meticulously drafted world. We began to talk. He would find me at my carrel, bringing 2 cups of terrible library coffee. He spoke not of coordinates, but of meaning, of the songlines of Australia that mapped the land through story, of medieval mappamundi that placed Jerusalem at the center of a world ringed by monsters. "Your husband's maps tell us how to navigate," he said one afternoon, his eyes alight. "But the old maps, the story maps, they tell us why we're navigating in the first place, what we're afraid of, what we're dreaming of." Alistair's world had no room for monsters or dreams. It was all measured fact. With Rhys, I felt parts of my mind, long dormant, the parts that loved myth, symbol, the unverifiable stir awake. It was an intellectual affair long before it became a physical one. The first true betrayal was an act of clandestine cartography. Rhys showed me a 17th century map of the English coastline, upon which some long ago hand had sketched in faint, worried ink a series of "Here be witches" and "Sirens Call" reported here. in the margins. The forbidden layer, he whispered, our heads close together over the vellum. The human layer, the one they couldn't put in the official key. The intimacy of that moment, hunched over a shared secret on ancient paper, was more electrifying than any touch. I started lying, small, logistical lies drawn with a steady hand. Late meeting with the archival team. Working dinner to discuss the Forsyth cataloging system. Alistair, whose trust was as absolute and unquestioning as a north arrow on a map, would nod. Don't work too hard, my dear. His faith was a foundational meridian of our life, and I had begun to secretly calculate a new prime meridian, one that ran through Reese Morgan's chaotic, story-filled apartment across town. That apartment was my true terra incognita. It was a glorious mess. Books stacked on the floor, ethnographic masks frowning from the walls, a large table strewn with old maps, not for their accuracy, but for their annotations, the doodles in the margins, the worried notes about weather, the hopeful sketches of safe harbors. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something indefinably vital. Here there was no silence. There was music, folk songs, strange wailing field recordings from Mongolia. Here time was not measured in the ticking of the long case clock in our hall, but in the rising and falling of passionate conversation. The physical affair began there, on a rainy autumn afternoon, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 unverified tales. It was not a gentle exploration, but a deliberate crossing of a border. His touch was sure, mapping my body as a landscape of sensation, not a known quantity. He kissed the hollow of my throat and called it a hidden spring. He traced the line of my spine and murmured about mountain ranges yet to be named. He made me feel like a discovery, not a settled province. Afterwards, lying amidst a tumble of cushions and errant papers, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of dislocation. I was off the map. Thus began my life as a double agent. I became a forger of my own coordinates. I kept 2 logs. The official one, social engagements with Alistair's colleagues, symphony dates, reminders to order more India ink. The secret one, scribbled in a small leather-bound notebook I hid inside a hollowed-out volume of Ordnance Survey guidelines. Coded entries like R, discuss Cornwall Phantom Roads, or T, tea and tales. The latter meant his apartment, his bed, his world. The logistics required a navigator's precision. I bought a second, cheap mobile phone, a burner, he called it, a thrillingly illicit term, and kept it switched off in the bottom of my library bag. I developed a ritual of transformation, leaving our ordered house in my sensible wool skirts and pearls, changing in a library bathroom stall into softer, looser clothes Reese had complimented, then reversing the process before returning home, scrubbing the scent of his sandalwood soap from my wrists. I was charting 2 separate lives, and the strain of keeping them from colliding was a constant, low-grade tremor in my soul. The guilt was a corrosive sea, eroding my coastline. It flooded in at moments of Alistair's unconscious devotion, when he carefully framed one of my few delicate watercolor sketches of a bird and hung it in his study. When he brought me a cup of tea exactly at 4 p.m., his hand resting gently on my shoulder. When he talked about our future, about buying a cottage in the Lake District for his retirement, a place where he could map the changing light on the fells, just for us. His love was a fixed, known point. My betrayal was the magnetic deviation throwing every compass off. To cope, I began to subtly sabotage the piece of our mapped world. I would misplace one of his prized, razor-sharp mapping pens. I'd play a radio station with jazz, its syncopated rhythms an affront to his love of Baroque order. I was trying subconsciously to introduce error, to make his perfect world less perfect, to justify my flight into the glorious inaccuracies of Reese's arms. Reese's world was all glorious inaccuracy. He celebrated the fuzzy edge, the subjective experience. He took me on field work to a pub in the Suffolk countryside where locals swore a nearby barrow mound was a fairy hill, and he listened to their stories with a scholar's intensity and a believer's heart. He saw magic in the margins. With him, I felt not just desired, but necessary, the audience for his theories, the scribe to his explorations. With Alistair, I was a footnote in the established text of his life. Alistair, the master observer, began to notice the changes in his human terrain. Not evidence, but shifts in the emotional climate. My new restlessness during our quiet evenings. The way I sometimes stared out the window as if searching for a landmark he couldn't see. The unfamiliar, lingering scent on my scarf once, which I explained away as a new library disinfectant. "You seem distant lately, Clara," he said one evening, looking up from a satellite survey of the Amazon basin. His eyes, magnified slightly by his reading glasses, were kind and concerned. "Is the library work too much? That folklorist fellow Morgan isn't distracting you, is he? I've heard his theories are rather fanciful." The acuity of his guess was a direct hit. "He's just a colleague," I said, my voice admirably steady. "It's stimulating to have a different perspective." Alistair removed his glasses, polishing them slowly on his linen handkerchief. "Perspective is everything in cartography," he said mildly, "but one must always correct for distortion. Emotional distortion is the most perilous of all." He put his glasses back on and returned to his maps, but a new watchful stillness had entered the room. The crisis was precipitated by a literal map. Reese, in a gesture of reckless romanticism, gave me a gift. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn facsimile of a 15th century Portolan chart of the Mediterranean. But in the margins, where the old cartographers drew windheads and sea monsters, Reese had added his own annotations in his flowing script. Next to a rendering of a rocky island, he'd written, "Here on the night of November 7th, Clara Finch discovered a new continent of feeling. Near a compass rose. True north is the sound of her laugh." It was a love letter in the language of our obsession. It was also a nuclear device wrapped in vellum. I was horrified and deliriously moved. I hid it in my secret notebook, between the pages, but the danger of it hummed in my veins. Weeks later, Alistair decided we needed to host a small dinner for a delegation of Japanese geodesists. I was to prepare the dining room. In a frantic rush, needing a specific book on plate tectonics as a reference for the centerpiece, I barged into his study without my usual knock. He was at his desk, but he wasn't working. He was holding my secret notebook. The Portolan chart facsimile was unfolded beside it, Reese's damning annotations glaring up from the parchment. He must have been looking for a receipt, a note, anything, and had pulled the hollowed-out guidebook from the shelf. The hollow was too obvious a hiding place for a man who spent his life finding what was hidden. Time stopped. The air left the room. He looked from the chart to me, his face undergoing a horrific transformation. The familiar landscape of his features, the kind eyes, the thoughtful mouth, seemed to fracture and rearrange into an expression of utter, cataclysmic devastation. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that the foundational map of his life is a forgery, that the north he has been steering by is a lie. He didn't speak. He simply laid the notebook and the chart down on the desk with a terrifying gentleness, as if they were unstable explosives. "Who," he said finally, the words scraping out of him, "is the cartographer of this?" There was no navigation out of this, no alternative route. The evidence was laid bare in his own study, on his own desk. The secret layer had been violently overlaid onto the official one. I confessed. Standing there in the doorway, clutching the doorframe for support, I gave him the raw, unprojected truth. "Reese, the library, the stories, the apartment, the physical affair, the lies." I spared no detail, offering up the full, ugly topography of my betrayal. As I spoke, I watched the world he had built, a world of trust, precision, and shared silence, collapse into rubble. I had not just broken a promise, I had proven that his entire philosophy, his belief in the knowable, the chartable, the true, was bankrupt when applied to the human heart. When my voice finally failed, the silence was absolute. It was the silence of a vast, empty plain after an extinction-level event. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at our neat, geometric garden. "My life's work," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it, "has been to eliminate error, to take the vague, the rumored, the mythical, and render it clear, fixed, and real. I believed our marriage was my greatest success, a known country, a safe harbor. He turned and his eyes were dry but utterly ruined. But you, Clara, you were a blank space all along, and you filled yourself with phantoms. You have introduced a monstrous, incurable error into the core of my world. There is no correction for this. The map is irredeemable. He moved out that night. His packing was a lesson in clinical excision. He took his professional tools, his personal journals, the photograph of us at our wedding standing before a giant globe. He left the house, the furniture, every single curated object of our shared life. I cannot live amidst the artifacts of a false civilization, he said at the door, a single leather bag in his hand. He didn't look back. The aftermath was a protracted, humiliating survey of the wreckage. Alistair was impeccably, brutally fair through his solicitor. The divorce was a swift, logical dissolution of assets. My father, a retired civil engineer who revered Alistair's exacting mind, was crushed. "You were given a masterpiece, Clara," he said, his voice trembling with disappointment, "and you defaced it with graffiti." In the numb weeks that followed, I went to Reese's apartment. I needed the creator of the phantom map, the man for whom I had torched my real world. He was distracted, surrounded by packing crates. His sabbatical was over. He'd taken a prestigious post at a university in California. "Clara, God, it's awful about Alistair," he said, running a hand through his hair. He looked genuinely distressed, but it was the distress of a man who has inadvertently stepped on a rare insect, not one who has lost a love. "Listen, I'm up to my eyes. This move, it's chaos." "I thought us," I stammered, the pathetic hope dying in my throat. He stopped packing for a moment and came to me, taking my hands. His were warm, familiar. What we had was extraordinary. A beautiful, intense story. But it was a story, Clara. My work is stories. I'm not the settling down kind. Alistair was your territory. I was just a fascinating diversion, a tale of a far-off country. He kissed my forehead, a benediction and a dismissal. "You'll write your own next chapter." He saw our affair as a compelling narrative arc, now concluded. I had been a primary source for his research on human passion, not the destination. The wild, uncharted land I had craved was, by its nature, uninhabitable. I left the library job. I sold the Georgian townhouse with its haunting, perfect order. I moved to a small, anonymous flat in a different city, a place with no history, no echoes. I took a job as a data entry clerk for a utility company. My world reduced to columns of numbers, the ultimate in sterile, meaningless fact. Now I live in a blank space. There are no maps on my walls. The silence here is not the deep, companionable quiet of the study, but a shallow, empty void. Sometimes in the dead of night, I wake thinking I hear the scratch of Alistair's pen or the cadence of Reese's laughter telling a tale. But there is only silence. I sought to escape a map for the thrill of the uncharted. But I was not an explorer. I was a settler who foolishly burned her own village for the allure of a campfire story. Now I am adrift in a dimensionless present, a woman who learned too late that the most terrifying terra incognita is not on any parchment, but in the mirrored wasteland of your own regret. I am the cartographer's ex-wife, forever lost in the negative space between the precise line and the glorious, ruinous lie.